threw away the key. Well, you're sort of stuck because you can't really count a ballot that's trapped in a lockbox, and you certainly can't add 10 other people's lockboxes together. Homomorphic cryptography was a way to add things that couldn't be seen together. And once you could do that, you could unlock a whole suite of really interesting ideas that would enhance the democratic experience. The biggest of which was that you'd have a receipt. You could go home and see that your vote was counted. But another one, almost as big, is that because the code that would run these programs would be open source, you could actually verify that the tally that's using this branch of math called homomorphic cryptography was correct. And so in theory, Chris or Ben, we could write these programs ourselves if we had a PhD in math, which we don't. But civic groups like the League of Women Voters or the Wall Street Journal or the Republican National Committee could write these verifier programs and distribute them to their voters. And on election night, you, me, or anyone could run these programs on an app on our phone and actually run the math and verify that the winner of the presidential election actually is the winner of the presidential election. And so once you bridged this divide between secrecy and verifiability, there were all sorts of new things that you could do that the analog version just simply wouldn't have allowed. And it's sort of a utopian vision of what democracy could look like.
So it's not that this new kind of system would be impervious to hacking. It's that if somebody hacked it, you'd know pretty much right away.
That's exactly right. So let's not get this notion of verifiability confused with perfect security. It just makes the point of hacking seem a whole lot less appetizing, right? So say you wanted to swing 30,000 votes from Joe the candidate to Bill the candidate, right? The problem with that is if you don't want to get caught, you will know that the votes have been swung probably within a few minutes, right? If every voter can go home after they vote and they drop their kids off at school and they go home and they log online and see that their vote doesn't match, we'll know right away that there's a problem. We'll know before lunchtime that there's a problem with the vote. So it affords a kind of perfect knowledge, but there's a trade-off here, and it's worth, an important point, and it's a point of debate, which is, knowledge can be a curse, right? And so if malefactors or bad guys aren't really interested in swinging the result, they're just interested in causing chaos or confusion, perfect knowledge is a dangerous thing, right? It might be the case that there are bad guys who want to delete, who knows, 2,000 or 3,000 votes, not enough to change the election, but just to cause an outcry. Before, we might not actually know whether 2,000 or 3,000 votes were deleted. We really rely on the Department of Homeland Security to tell us something like that. But now, we will really be in charge of our own destiny and know that fact. So with great power comes, great responsibility, and, the knowledge afforded by this technology, could have consequences. And the question of whether we're ready to take that step, I think, is a really interesting one.
Okay, so this all sounds very promising. It seems like once you know what's needed, you just build it and move on. What did it take for Dan Wallach, that guy who had been such a bother making his criticisms to Dana de Beauvoir? What did it take for him to build a prototype?
Right, so all of this math is what comes out of the mouth of Josh Benelo, the Yale researcher, and he approaches Dan Wallach and also Dana and says, I've got this amazing idea. And against sort of the odds, these two enemies, the clerk and the scientist, decide they're going to team up and try to build this thing. And they give it a name, they call it Starvote. And when word gets out about Starvote, this zany new idea, homomorphic what? People are sort of dazzled by the prospect of reinventing voting for the first time in 100 years. It is a categorical change in the way we vote. And some of the best technicians and scientists flew in, actually from all over the world, right into Austin in the county clerk's office for these various sessions that took place during the summers of 2012 and 2013. And they worked up a design for something that would do the homomorphic procedure, would allow people even with a high school grasp of computer science to verify the outcome of the election. It was pretty radical stuff. The problem was, how would they get it built? Their first step was that they wanted to see if they could publicly own the source code and publicly own the product. Like the idea was, remember early on, these clerks feel trapped by a very small private sector that are doing the best they can, but nevertheless building these machines that computer scientists feel are insecure. Could they break free of that? Well, one way would be to publicly own, sort of in the way that we publicly own the sewer system, right? This is sort of sewer socialism. Own the machines and own the code. And what you could then do, sort of the way Linux is an open source program that sometimes people use as an alternative to Microsoft, would be to give the technology away for free. And you'd have this sort of liberating revolution of free technology that clerks could then use as an alternative to the private sector of voting machines that were often very expensive and, critically under-engineered in some cases. The problem was that very few people had the technical capacity to build something like this. It was also new, it was also weird. People weren't interested in investing a lot of money in something that was so radical. And so once the idea sort of fell apart for public ownership, they went sort of hat in hand to the private sector and found that the private sector also wasn't particularly thrilled or interested in building it either. And so you had this sort of really good example of how interesting and new, innovative idea, we think of America as a country of nuclear ideas coming in cloud, falling between the cracks of the private sector transport and the public ownership and the public sector transport, falling between the cracks of both of these ideas. And what it really required was a big wake-up call for the country to take this seriously, for either one of those two, the public sector or the private sector, to wake up and actually try to invest in this thing. It really would have required a crisis, and a crisis is eventually what came.
This is Think. I'm Chris Boyd. So when you say big wake-up call, are you talking 2016?